Well, welcome back after that showing of patterns of evidence. We have the filmmaker himself and David Rohl with us right here in the Aviv Studios in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we have questions that have come in from around the world to pursue this. So we're going to go for a while and handle some questions here in our audience. Handle some questions that have come in from cyberspace around the world, and we trust that if you do not have yet the movie out there, if you do not have the movie, make sure that you order the movie. Get online now. The sun is set. The Sabbath is over. Make sure that this is the first thing on your agenda. Get the movie. Get your friends. Get your enemies. Get everyone together and show the video. Now, if you're going to be showing it to more than 100 people, which we intend fully here to be doing, we are planning on the Ballantine Theater here in Charlotte, North Carolina, to do a showing there. And so if you want to do a showing of a larger group, then of course you'll want to purchase the licensing for that particular event. And this is something that we are looking very much forward to speaking about tomorrow. Unfortunately, you will not be able to join us tomorrow. We are going to circle the wagons tomorrow morning here at the Aviv Moon Studios and get together like we do in our homes, and it has been done for thousands of years. Instead of doing things theater style where you have someone up front lecturing, which is a great way to disseminate information like what we're here. But that form does not allow the body to function very effectively in the assembly to where everyone can share, everyone can ask questions. So we're going to circle up the wagons tomorrow. We're going to discuss this, and we don't turn the cameras on because we don't want anyone to be impeded by it being broadcast. You know, this is family time. This is not show time. And what we do when we talk about, a show, the Shabbat Night Live, it's really a television program. This is not anything more than what has to be done, a format for broadcast. But when it comes to the intimacy of the fellowship in the home, that is where it is at. It never needs to get any bigger than that. If you're so big that you have to look for a shopping center to set up shop in, you probably need to break up into a few homes and have some elders, that are responsible, that are apt to teach, given to hospitality, who are good, stable, well instructed in the Word, that can continue to raise up leaders. This is what needs to happen out there. This is the only way that the church, so to speak, survived in China, because they went underground and it was all in the homes, and that's how they survived while the rest of the people were being put to death in the communist regime. So there's going to be coming a time that you're not going to be looking for mega churches out there. So we're going to do that tomorrow, and we're going to be discussing here how to get this message into our communities, how to get theaters and to invite different congregations and different groups out to be able to see these things, because now you are it. You have been handed off the baton, and you are the ones that have to get this out. And thankfully, we have some questions that have come up that is going to allow us to help the people get these nuggets to get the message out there. So we have the filmmaker, Tim Mahoney. We have David Rohl, the Egyptologist, with us, and I will ask a few questions. We have some questions coming up in the audience that Scott Laird will be taking the microphone around for that. So I'll start out with one of the first ones that we have here. And first of all, I'll ask this to Tim. Do you have any keystone moment or insight that brought all the pieces of the puzzle into clarity for you?
No. Well, it's hard to answer that question because, trying to think about bringing it into clarity. I think that, I think about a question like that, I think that there was a period of time when I realized that Ramesses was the problem. And I walked into my office one day and I said, we have to kill Ramesses. I said, we have to kill Ramesses off because everyone believes that Ramesses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I said, I think that this is the light that basically I started out to realize that there was something that everyone, all the movies that were ever made, was, Ramesses was the character of the Exodus. So the whole culture has this understanding that Ramesses is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And that has permeated throughout. But that is also the reason why people say that there is no evidence for the story of the Bible.
Well, that's right.
And so that's when we started realizing that this earlier archaeology was showing up that Ramesses couldn't be the Pharaoh. So I said, we've got to basically deal with Ramesses. And that, I think, would be one of those moments.
And we have other questions that are related to that we're going to be touching on in just a moment. But I'll ask David that same question. Any moments in your career that were the clinch point for you, that changed the game?
I think it was really when we decided that Shishak could not be Shoshenq. And then we found this remarkable match with what we call the hypochoristicon, the short form of Ramesses' name, Sisa or Shisha. And then when we found that this letter Kof and this letter Wav had interchanged over time to give us the K on the end of Shishak, that for me was the clinching moment.
Yeah, that's right. So we have Shishak, who invades Judah.
Yes, right. Conquers Judah, takes the treasures out of the Temple of Solomon, takes them back to Egypt.
Okay, now let's talk about those treasures for a moment, because this is something that comes up, because it specifies what's taken, does it not?
The golden shields are taken out of the temple, and the treasures are taken out of the palace as well. Now remember, this is 5 years after the death of Solomon, so Israel is at its peak wealth-wise. Solomon's the richest of the kings of Israel. His son succeeds him, Rehoboam, and he immediately builds all these fortresses to protect Egypt from an invasion from the south. He knows what's coming. He knows it's coming from Egypt.
And so he knows the Pharaoh is
Shishak.
Shishak, who is also known as
Ramesses, Sisa or Shisha. The greatest Pharaoh of Egypt is about to invade his country.
Okay, now, Solomon marries his daughter.
Absolutely. According to Talmudic tradition, beginning of Solomon's reign, he gets an Egyptian queen to who he marries, and then he sends her off to a palace outside Jerusalem because she's worshipping pagan gods. She pollutes the palace where the temple is actually going to be built and where the ark is resting. Okay, so he sends her off and exiles her to this palace. And that's going to, forgive me, piss off Pharaoh quite mightily. Because he's just sent his daughter to marry Solomon, and he's saying, she's not number 1 wife, she's number 12 wife. And Solomon's successor was not Pharaoh's daughter's son.
Okay, so now
that's why Papa gets miffed, gets angry with the successor of Solomon, and invades Judah, takes the treasures and says, behave, don't be a naughty boy.
Okay, now, and we go forward, and now into time, and it is Shoshenq.
Yeah, mistakenly thought to be Shishak.
Right, and he invades northern Israel.
Yeah, and he takes on a completely different role.
That's
because
right.
now, with Shoshenq dated later, he becomes the savior of Israel in the time of Jehoahaz. When the Arameans from Damascus are raiding, destroying all the cities, plundering the northern kingdom, the Egyptian Pharaoh comes out and kicks the Arameans out. And in the Bible it says Jehoahaz is sent a savior by Yahweh, who then throws out the Arameans. And that is the role that Shoshenq plays in the right area. His campaign is in the Jezreel Valley, in the Jordan, in the Sharon Plain. That's exactly where the Arameans are going.
Oh, that's right. And that is what is recorded at Karnak.
It's all, yes, that's the Shoshenq campaign scene that we have there, is the throwing out of the Arameans back to Damascus and saving the northern kingdom of Israel from its fate.
Outstanding, outstanding. I mean, that to me too, as we were discussing, these are the 5 smooth stones out there for several people. That was it, to understand who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was, and the problem of understanding Shoshenq and Shishak being 2 different ones, 2 different campaigns, 2 different time periods.
Absolutely.
And it was confused more than 100 years ago, and no one saw it through.
And isn't it ironic that the one key figure in this is Ramesses, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the bad guy, and then suddenly he's later on, he's the guy who actually plundered the Temple of Solomon. He changed his role completely.
Incredible.
Well, there's another point that I will say that when you said, well, what was an aha moment, was when I started to realize that many other scholars haven't really thought much about it, nor do they know the details of some of the ideas that we're talking about with the challenge with time. And I realized that even though they'll talk about it, they really don't. I don't think they quite understood it. And so they didn't understand what they were upset about. You know what I mean? Wouldn't you say that's quite the case? And there's no time to even be interested in it. So the challenge is I'm not going to talk about it, and so that was another insight to me, because I'm wanting to be around people that are open and interested in learning about new things and the truth of it. So anyway.
Can I ask you a question then? When you interviewed all these famous scholars, you were trying to get them to give you reasons why they disagreed with this whole revised scheme. And you said to me that you didn't actually get any reasons from them. They didn't actually go into any detail. Wasn't that revelatory to you as well, that they didn't actually explain their argument?
Right. I think that the challenge was, it was very, if I tried to bring up the question of, is there a problem with dating, that idea was almost sacred. And so
they stamped on it. Bang.
Yeah.
No, they don't want to talk about it.
Right. And once again, it's because I don't believe that, you see, there's very few people that actually deal with the dating, the chronology. So the difference is if you're a chronologist, which is what you are, the rest of people are working in other fields. They get their tape measure from the chronologists. And so the question of a chronologist then is, the chronologist, the Egyptian chronologist set the dates for the rest of the ancient world in the Mediterranean. And so that was another revelation. Now that you brought that up, yeah, that's the third one, was that you had to be a chronologist in order to really interpret these things. And some of these people were just saying, hey, great people from the past have given us excellent work, and it's not questionable.
Yeah.
Isn't that pretty much the way
That's
the line
exactly
is?
as it is, yeah.
So there you go.
Okay. We have another question here. Is it true the ancient Egyptians misrepresented their recorded history of themselves in a different light, such as conquering instead of being conquered? Probably David would be the one.
I suppose what that question is really honing in on is the idea that the pharaohs were so boastful that they wouldn't admit defeat in any occasion. And that is probably the case in most civilizations. No king is going to say, I got whooped by the opposition. You know, they don't do that sort of thing. They make excuses. There's one good example of a pharaoh who went on a campaign towards Syria, northern Syria. And he had a difficult time. And instead of fighting a battle that he was supposed to have won, he actually turns it into an elephant hunt because he's been trounced. But he doesn't want to say that he's been trounced, so he says, I went on an elephant hunt instead. So we end up in a situation where he's making excuses. However, I have to say, there are two examples in Egyptian history where they do admit the problems. One we saw today in the film, the Ipuwer Papyrus, where you have a scribe coming to the king and say, look what happened to us. All these terrible plagues hit the country, and the slaves walked off with all our gold. Now that's the story in the Bible of the Exodus, and here we have an Egyptian document referring to it. So that's an honest document, that's not hyperbole. Okay, and later on, Queen Hatshepsut refers back to the time when the Hyksos kings were in Egypt and were destroying the country and wrecking the temples. So we have two good examples there, where we have admissions on the part of the Egyptians that there were problems. And so I wouldn't say that the Egyptians hide everything by any means.
Okay. We're going to go to now to our audience. I believe we've got some questions out there.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Good.
So this question would be for anybody in the panelists, more so to David Rohl, because he's the expert chronologist there. I know your expertise is in dealing with the third intermediate period, which is considered a dark age. Egypt also had two other intermediate periods where it's considered a dark age as well.
Yeah.
Would you see those other two periods of the dark age plus modern dating systems such as dendrochronology and carbon-14 dating also additional elements to showcase that there's problems with the timeline of ancient Egypt?
By definition, these intermediate periods are periods of confusion. When we have a kingdom period where we have the whole land united by a single pharaoh, succeeded by another pharaoh, we can be fairly certain what's happening. When we get to the intermediate periods, what they mean is the country is divided up into smaller kingdoms. So you have a northern kingdom, a southern kingdom, a middle kingdom, all ruled by different pharaohs. Then it gets complicated, and then we have to really work out what's going on with the chronology, because we might have a list of kings, but they might overlap. These kings might be from different dynasties overlapping each other. So it gets very complicated, and so there are very few Egyptologists who look into these dark periods, the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and my specialism, the third intermediate period. Now, when you mentioned dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating, that's the scientific methods that people try to use these days to try and date the ancient world, finding artifacts that are perishable living things that have died, and the radiocarbon is degenerating in them, so you're able to date them by using Libby's decay curve. That's a very complicated process, and it's calibrated by dendrochronology, as you know. It is full of potential errors, and we know of many reasons why radiocarbon dating is suspect. So I would say I personally do not trust the C14 process and the dendrochronology at this stage. I prefer to use the historical analysis to do my dating systems, because too many times we've been shown that radiocarbon dating pushes everything much, much older than it used to be in the old days. So, for instance, the pyramids are pushed back 200 or 300 years. The Middle Kingdom is pushed back 200 years. The early Bronze Age is now, just very recently, being pushed back 300 years. So everything is pushing things older, 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 older. And what I'm doing is saying everything should be younger, 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 younger. So I'm going in the opposite direction. So I don't think we can really seriously trust dendro at the moment and radiocarbon dating. So we simply have to work things out the best way as we can. And it's an old adage, but it's true to say that what we have with history is it's our best interpretation of the past. It's not what actually happened. We may never know what happened. It's our best guess at what happened. Okay? And histories are tested by how accurate they are and how many anomalies they solve. So the best history is the one that solves the most problems. It may not be perfect, but it's as best as we can do. The past is what happened. History is our best guess at what happened.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we have another one came from cyberspace. This is concerning Velikovsky's theory that Egyptology has been misdated, and with his understanding and with your new chronology, is there anything that that fits together with this?
It has to be admitted that Emanuel Velikovsky in the 1950s came up with the idea that Egyptian dating had to be revised. He wasn't the first to do it. Sir Isaac Newton was the first one to suggest that ancient Egyptian chronology should be shortened. And there have been a number of other people since then who have proposed this idea. But Velikovsky is the most famous one in the 1950s. He had a very successful book called Ages in Chaos, which was published then. A lot of people read it and a lot of people followed his ideas. And he was the one, actually, that originally suggested that Ipuwer Papyrus was a reflection of the plagues of the Bible, of the Exodus story. So he, in fact, was the first one to actually argue that case. Where he went wrong, in my view, he then went too far with his reconstruction, and he actually suggested that Queen Hatshepsut, the great pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, was the Queen of Sheba. So he was trying to go too far with everything. That resulted in him having to compress Egyptian history by 600 years, and that proved to be impossible. So we ended up in a situation where his efforts to reduce the chronology were simply too extreme, too difficult. The revision that we're using today is, in fact, a revision of around 250 to 300 years. It's much less, and it's much easier to deal with. So you're actually dealing with Velikovsky's chronology, which we now think probably failed, although he did get the same pharaoh of the Exodus we're talking about, Dudimose, and he did get Ipuwer Papyrus as the reflection of the plagues. So he was right in his starting point, but he went too far in trying to make the Queen of Sheba into Queen Hatshepsut.
Okay, excellent. Do we have another one from the audience here? Right, stand up.
I would like to know the reaction Finkelstein when he saw the final movie. Did you? And I'm sure he did.
Did Finkelstein even see the movie?
Well, I've sent it to him, and I don't know. I don't have his reaction. No, I've sent the film out to different people, and some people are disappointed, obviously, because in the very beginning their positions were. I mean, I didn't go down that track, and Israel Finkelstein, after I interviewed him, he invited me to come and dig with him. And my son's wedding was the following year at the same time, and I said, well, I'm going to have to take a rain check. And but we've been communicating through email, and I'm going to follow up and find out where we're at with it. And I told him, and I said, you know, we talked about friendship in a sense, and I said, because he said, you know, he really enjoyed meeting me, and I really enjoyed meeting him, and I know that he cares. Believe it or not, Finkelstein cares very, very much about this, about the Bible. He risked his life doing surveys. You know, there are snipers that were out back in the day when he was walking, and people were shot at, and I think one person was killed surveying Israel, and so he's a very courageous man, and even though he's come up with you know, a completely different opinion, he told me that he has friends that that believe in the Bible just as it's written, and he and them are still friends. And I said, well, I'm of the same position, that I'm in the area that I think that these events happen. And he says, well, we can be friends, and I think that that's part of the whole idea here, is to have a relationship with people and have conversation about these things. And so I'm hoping that I still do with Israel Finkelstein, and we'll see.
And can I just add that there are obviously many academics who don't like these ideas and have openly said so. But you get some open-minded ones as well. For instance, on the 20th of this month, we're going down to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to be giving a lecture for the Biblical Archaeology Forum there. And we're having Professor Eric Klein from George Washington University coming along to critique my performance. And Betsy Bryan from Johns Hopkins University, she's an Egyptologist. Two of the finest scholars in this country are coming along open-mindedly to listen and to debate and discuss these ideas. So there are open-minded scholars around. We mustn't suggest for 1 minute that it's just people who are all saying, no, we're not going to listen.
Yeah, and I think the idea as a filmmaker for me in asking these questions, I think that these are important questions to be asked. And if there's new information, then let's look at it. And you can see in the world of physics and in the world of sciences, there's constantly new discoveries that are happening, and people are having to change. So I don't, and that's the whole idea of Gardner. When I went to, I think it was, yeah, when I went to Oxford, realized that what he said was, Sir Alan Gardner said that we have rags and tatters. And I asked Kent Weeks, is that true? Is it still true? And he says, yes, it is. The fact is that the information that's coming from Egypt is still just rags and tatters. They're trying to piece this history. So it's not that there's, in my mind, I think there's an opportunity to question these things.
We have the situation in Israel, in the city of David. There have been paintings that have been done over the last several years, really over the last 15 years, the archaeological dig there. There were conclusions that were made. Everything seemed to make a lot of sense, and then they kept digging. And they kept digging, and that's why every time we go, we get an archaeologist from the site there to do our tour for us, because nobody else can keep up with what they're finding there, because it's having to be revised as we keep on digging deeper there. So there's more and more to be found, but the exciting thing is the more that they dig, the more truth is revealed, rather than things that are contrary to the scripture.
The great Yigal Yadin, the famous archaeologist from Israel who dug at Hatzor, he once said that in his time they'd only excavated 10% of what was under the ground, and it would take another 200 years before they even got close to finding out what was there.
Here's the question. The people occupying the land of Egypt today, are they the same race of people that were occupying Egypt at the time of Moses?
The answer is yes and no. We have a
Excellent
large
answer.
population of Muslims living in Egypt who come from Arabia. When Islam swept across North Africa towards Spain and established the Kingdom of Andalusia, before that they conquered Egypt and established the Caliphate in Cairo. So many of the people who live in Egypt today are Muslim Arabs. They originate from the Arab world. However, there is a population, about 10% of the total population of Egypt, who are Copts, Coptic Christians. And the word Copt comes from Hekupta, which is Egyptos in Greek, which means Egyptian. So these people believe themselves to be descended from the pharaonic kingdom of Egypt. So I think it's reasonable to say, and they even, in their rituals, in their churches, they even speak the ancient Egyptian language and sing the ancient Egyptian language, the Coptic form of it. So we think those people are genuine Egyptians, and in fact, if you look at many Egyptians, if you look at their faces in profile, in full frontal, you see them on the walls of the tombs, the reliefs. You see those same people there. So even though many of the Egyptians today may be speaking Arabic, maybe Muslims, they may still have Egyptian blood in them, going way back thousands of years.
We have a question from John. He really loved your book and the video, Pharaohs and Kings. He asked the question, have Egyptologists found any more Apis bull burials? Has any other things come to light since you did Pharaohs and Kings in light of this?
Right, that's a way off to the right of what we've been talking about, but it's an interesting subject. One of the things that I did when I was studying the third intermediate period was investigating what we call anomalies. Those are things where things don't quite add up, and this is an instance where, for instance, we have the burial vaults of the Apis bulls at Saqqara, and an entire dynasty of kings were not represented in the bull burials. Apis bulls are a little bit like the Dalai Lama. You only ever have one alive at any one time. When the bull dies, they go off and look for the replacement bull that has to have the right markings, and they bring it to the temple of Ptah in Memphis, and they worship it. And the ladies come along and they lift their skirts in front of the bull to expose themselves for fertility reasons, and there's all sorts of games going on like that. The Apis bull represented the god Ptah, and when he died, he represented the god Osiris. So he has a special underground vault at Saqqara where each of the bulls were buried. And one dynasty, the 21st dynasty, was completely missing from this vault. And I realized what was going on there was that the 21st dynasty was contemporary with the 22nd dynasty, which did have bulls. And so we have this missing 123 years of one dynasty, which was parallel with the latest 22nd dynasty, which wasn't in fact late at all. It was the same time. So what this gentleman is asking there is, has any more bulls been found? And the answer is no. We haven't found any more bulls. I was involved in those excavations with Mohammed Ibrahim, who was the director of Saqqara at the time, and since then no more bulls have been found, and it looks like this is a genuine anomaly within Egyptian archaeology.
Any more questions from our audience here? Okay, very good. My phone to him.
You said, you indicated earlier that Joseph probably invented the alphabet. And I was wondering if, well, that would probably indicate then, since the inscriptions were at the turquoise mines, that then the Israelites were working those mines. Yeah. Would that be?
That's absolutely correct. The vizier, which Joseph was, is responsible for pretty much all the labor forces in the country. One of the things he set up was something called the Department of the People's Giving, and that was a department that actually had corvée workers, Hebrew Israelite workers, going out and planting the fields to grow the extra barley to put into the grain stores. So we know he set this up. It's a complete, fantastic distribution system whereby all the workforce goes out, they plant the crops, and they bring the supplies back to government silos where they put all the grain storage. And then when the famine comes, Joseph distributes the grain back out to the people. The Department of the People's Giving. They give their work, they receive the grain back. It's another part of Joseph's work. And one of the other things he had to do was organize the mining in Sinai. So he sent expeditions out to Sinai to get the turquoise and to get the copper so that that could be brought back to Egypt for the decorations and for the metalwork. And that would be part of the role of the vizier. And in fact, most of the workers who worked in the copper and the turquoise mines were Semitic. They were Hebrews, not Egyptians. It was seasonal work. They went out in the winter. They didn't go out in the summer. They went and extracted the precious metals and the turquoise, and they came back before the heat of the summer. So it was like an expedition. Sinai was never part of Egypt in those days. It's only been part of Egypt since the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the beginning of the First World War, end of the First World War. So Sinai was a foreign country. It wasn't actually part of Egypt. Egypt stopped when the desert started, outside the delta. That was no longer Egypt after that. So these expeditions were sent out to the gold mines and to the copper mines and to the turquoise mines out of Egypt. Remember, Egypt's name is called Kemet or Kemi, which means the black land. And that's referring to the black soil of the Nile Valley in the delta. Deshret, the red land, is the desert. And we get our word desert from the Egyptians. The word Deshret means the red land, and we use the word desert in our language. It's the same thing. And we even use the word Kemi. Kemi is the black land, the name for Egypt, becomes in Greek chemistry. And in Arabic, alchemy, the black, alchemy. So that's all about the black arts of Egypt, the magicians of Egypt that we hear about in the story of Moses and the stick being thrown on the ground and the magicians throwing their sticks on the ground, turning them into snakes. This was the country of magic. And the reason we call it black magic is because it comes from the black land, Egypt. So we get two words, alchemy and chemistry, from the name of ancient Egypt. Isn't that amazing? Yeah,
it is amazing. Now, this is somewhat related to this. This is something you and I discussed a little bit earlier. Tom writes, could it be possible the small pyramid with the other 11 tombs in Goshen that appears to have the statue of Joseph might be not a tomb but a memorial to Joseph by the Egyptians? I've thought for some time that Joseph's tomb was built for the Egyptians to be, or by the Egyptians to be a step pyramid in Saqqara or Sukkot, Egypt. I believe this is where the large underground granaries that Joseph are, and where the nations came to buy grain and set up their temporary dwellings.
Okay, this is a controversial question. Saqqara, first of all, it's named after the god Sokar, who's the god of the dead, the falcon god of the dead. That's where it gets its name from. The step pyramid belongs to the 3rd dynasty, so this is even before the Great Pyramid is built in the time of Khufu and the Giza pyramids. It's the dynasty before that. It's the time of King Zoser, or Joseph. And what's being referred to here is the idea that's been expressed by a number of people that Joseph is in fact the Egyptian vizier Imhotep, who was the architect for the step pyramid. Now, a lot of people have suggested this, but I want you to think about this. If we look at the timeline, we know that the time of Abraham and Lot was when the great cities were destroyed in this massive event that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and all those other cities. Now, culturally speaking, the time that Abraham moved down into Canaan is what we call the transition between the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age. And the destructions take place at the end of the early Bronze Age. So if Sodom and Gomorrah and these other cities are destroyed at the end of EB3, which is where we see this massive destruction all across the country at that time, then clearly that is after the time of the Great Pyramid, and it's after the time of Zoser and the Step Pyramid. So you'd have to reverse the order of the patriarchs. You'd have to have Joseph hundreds of years before Abraham. And that just doesn't make sense to me. Secondly, these underground vaults you're referring to, including the Serapeum where the Apis bulls are not grain stores. They could not be grain stores. You do not put grain underground. If you do, you get all sorts of diseases from damp and other reasons. You have to put grain stores above ground. You build a building, you have silos above ground, you have a ramp which the people carry the sacks up and they drop the grain to the bottom and they extract the grain from the bottom with a hatch. That's how it's done. And administrators sign off all the amounts that are coming into the grain stores. They're built on the desert plateau looking down on the cultivation so that when the floods come, it doesn't reach the grain. So the type of thing you must look for a grain store is a structure with just like the altar over there, with little horns on the corners, with a ramp going up, silos you drop the grain into, and then you extract the grain from the bottom with a hatch. And we've got lots of examples of those made of mud brick in Egypt. That's the type of thing that Joseph would have organized. He would not have put grain underground, and the pyramids are not grain stores. That's my view on the subject.
Okay.
And I actually went to Saqqara and I filmed this area and I filmed this whole idea. And one of the things that was the challenge is that it was probably 1,000 years earlier. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
About 1,000 years earlier. So then the times that we're talking about. And so that was one of the challenges that I was faced with.
The other issue is, of course, would Joseph have put grain where there's lots of dead bodies? That certainly would not be a good policy. If you're going to eat grain, you don't bury your grain in underground vaults where there's a load of dead bodies around the place, which is what Saqqara is, a necropolis. So that would also be a good reason not to put the grain there. It's the land of the dead.
And so you're placing this at the time of the Great Rift Valley, the big shaking of the earth at the time of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim.
Claude Schaeffer, the famous French archaeologist, worked out that pretty much every single city in the early Bronze Age was destroyed in one instant across the land, including Sodom and Gomorrah. They all went at the same time, earthquake, destruction, all the occupation's gone, everybody disappears, the land is changed, and then suddenly new people come from the north. We call them Arameans. The wandering Aramean is Abraham, and they come in to enter the land. So in the case of Abraham, he was a precursor because he came down before the destructions, because Lot went to Sodom and the city was destroyed. So Abraham's already there, but we then have more people coming down from that same area and settling in Canaan from the north. And the reason they do that is because all the cities have been destroyed. There's no longer government there. So these pastoralists are allowed to come down and work their way through all this destruction and settle in this area.
I see, in the Great Rift Valley, just south of the Dead Sea, that the lines in the earth are 100 kilometers. There's literally a 100-kilometer shift, and the patterns are exact. So it was a major shaking of the earth at that point.
It affected everybody.
And so Abraham went down into Egypt because of the dearth in the land of Canaan at that point.
Absolutely. And we find, at the same time, we find that Egypt collapses, the Old Kingdom collapses at the very same moment. And so we get a group of kings coming from the Fayum, which we call the 9th and 10th dynasties, and they're the pharaohs who met and introduced Abram to the country and talked to Abraham and allowed him to stay for a while. And then what happens is we even get text mentioning from this period saying, beware of those Semites coming to Egypt because they trick you, they tell you lies. And what does Abraham do? He pretends his wife is his sister.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, this is very fascinating because, when we speak of new chronology and adjusting these things according to reality, then we don't know where the shaking stops. Absolutely. But I've learned from experience that when what you believe you find is not true, then what you discover afterward is a greater truth, and you don't have to be afraid of it. All you have to do is just keep on hungering, looking for the truth. And so, to have an Egyptologist of your background and desire from a youth, and finally, this is kind of the culmination of a 7-year-old's dream.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've still got more to do.
Yeah, that's
we
right.
all have to learn. We have to keep learning to the grave.
That's right. Okay, more questions from the audience here. These are the folks that came the furthest. We're going to go to them first.
Yeah, I've heard that Pharaoh Tom was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I know some of these kings, they have different names and titles, and is there any way to reconcile that, or do you know?
This is one of the Velikovskian ideas. There's an inscription on a naos. A naos is a little shrine that is in the Holy of Holies of a temple. It comes from El Arish, which is quite near to Gaza. And it was found there, so it's called the El Arish Naos. And the inscription on it is a mythological text which mentions a pharaoh called Tum or Tom who dives into the whirlpool and drowns. And this people, Velikovsky in particular, but other people, are considered to be the story of the miracle of the sea and the drowning of Pharaoh and his army. Now, it may be that that's the case, but it's dated from the 26th dynasty, which is the Persian, approaching the Persian period. It's actually in known history. It's the time of the Hellenistic Greeks coming along, and then later the Romans. It's actually much later than this figure Tom, who is a mythical character. So he's a little bit like King Arthur. We don't have any real history for him. It's a legend about a king from the past. So what do you do with this name Tom or Tum? Okay, well, it's possibly Artum, the god Artum, and it may have something to do with Pithom of the Bible, the other city that the Israelites are supposedly built. But it also could be Dudimais or Tutimos that we talked about. Tutimaeus could become Tom, abbreviated, who may well have drowned in the Miracle of the Sea episode, the Yam Suf. So it's a mythologized text from much, much later, referring to some hero king who drowned in a whirlpool. We could say no more than that, other than it could be the story of the Exodus and the Miracle of the Sea. Identifying the pharaoh is another matter.
So Dutamos or Tutmos?
Yeah, Tutmos, yeah. Tom, Tum.
Okay, very good. Here we have a question that comes up for Tim specifically, and this may be a case of perhaps not listening carefully. In Patterns of Evidence, there was a segment about the infant mortality rate of males under the age of 2, increasing at a certain period of time that alluded to the firstborn males being slain in Egypt by the Egyptians during the time of Moses. Where does this evidence come from, and to what year does this data point to?
Well, David was actually the one who made me aware of this, but BTEC had anthropological archaeologists that actually looked at the graves, and it came from the same time period, the multiplication, wasn't it, after the time?
It's what we call the Middle Bronze 2A, so it's the 13th dynasty.
Right.
And effectively, any archaeological team that has burials to deal with have to have anthropologists to investigate the bones, because they age the skeletons. They tell you how old the skeletons are, whether they're male or female, whether they have diseases. What these people found was a lot of Harris lines in the bones, which meant that they weren't receiving proper nutrients. That's why we think there was slavery, because they were not the same people that were there earlier who were doing very well for themselves. Suddenly, these people were impoverished. So not only did they find the problems with the skeletons of the adults, and this skew between male and female, which is basically a sort of 4:3 or 3:2 ratio, but also they're the ones who found all these babies buried that were less than 1 year old.
So the gender of the babies was not discernible.
You can't.
Right.
You can't tell a male or female infant.
But how it was determined, and this is what you brought up in the motion picture, is that later the adults, it was 3 women to 2 men, so that would indicate that there was less adult men to die.
Yeah.
And so that would then indicate that it was more male children that were in the grave.
That's precisely the argument. That is precisely the argument.
Okay.
I think the other thing that we found out when we were looking at it on our own research was that we mentioned Cahoon, and that Cahoon had the same high infant mortality rate at about the same time. And there's one little interesting tidbit was that they couldn't figure out, but there was tent stakes, like they had made these tent poles, and they found them because this Cahoon site was abandoned as well. They couldn't figure out, well, everyone just left. And but this idea of tent poles, they were left behind, and they were like, well, what were they going to use? And obviously, if they were going to be going out into the desert, they would have needed these tent stakes.
Interesting, but I think wrong, because the method of camping with a tent is to use stones to secure a tent base. So when you go out in the desert, you quite often find these rings of stones you see all over the place in the Negev. They are simply emplacements for the poles of the tent to be held down in case the wind blows them up, and they put the stones around to protect the base. So they don't use tent pegs in that context. But what is very interesting, we're in Tabernacles now, Sukkot, yeah? And a place 20 miles southeast of Goshen is called Tel El Maskuta in the Wadi Chumalat. Tel El Maskuta becomes Mas Sukkot, which means from the tents, from the tabernacles. And it is a place in the Middle Bronze Age where you find a huge camp of Semites waiting to move off somewhere. Now, these Israelites are all over Egypt. They're not just in the land of Goshen. They're in the Fayum. They're at all these other science centers. They have to get together. They have to gather at some place. And that place is Sukkot, the first place they go to when they leave Goshen. So Tel El Maskuta, Masukot from Sukkot, is the gathering point from Pithom and from Avaris and from, what do you call it, Kahun and all these other places. They're all gathering in that one place to move off en masse out of Egypt. So the name is still preserved in the Arabic name of the site, Tel El Masukot, Tel El Maskuta.
Well, let me just challenge you, my friend, with the tent stakes. I seem to remember a story about someone fleeing and going to a tent. Do you remember the story?
Sisera.
He wanted
Sisera's
to hide.
not an Israelite.
Yeah, he wanted to hide, and he went to sleep, and the woman there took a tent stake and pounded through her head. So there you go. There's a tent stake right there.
But he's not an Israelite. He's from the Judges period. B, he's not an Israelite. C, he's a general in the army.
But the point was that
he got the nail driven through his head, but it was the offspring of Abraham's child, who was Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite.
Yeah.
But wasn't the tent stake an Israelite tent stake?
It was a Kenite tent stake.
Oh, well,
it would be a Kenite.
Exactly correct.
Well,
and don't forget,
so
the Israelites.
I think he gets a point on this.
I get one point for that.
But okay,
Yeah, he
but
does.
the Israelites the Israelites who went into the desert didn't have tents. They had booths. Remember?
So it's like a toll booth collection.
They made their bivouacs out of whatever they had, including palm leaves and things like that.
Okay.
I think they had tents.
Do you?
They were nylon tents with titanium poles.
Yeah.
We learned that
little
from
springy
A Rood
things that-
Awakening
yeah.
from Israel.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, beautiful. Any other questions right here? We have several other questions here in the audience.
If we're moving the time frame for the Exodus over, let's say, to the left, wouldn't that stand to reason that it would shift other periods in Israel's history as well, like, say, the Davidic dynasty?
Absolutely right. Absolutely, it's something that goes on. It doesn't start to resolve itself out until you get to the time of Omri and Ahab. They're the time when everything is fixed because they're tied to Assyrian chronology, and it's all pretty much established from that point onwards, down to the northern kingdom being exiled in 822 BC, and then later on Nebuchadnezzar coming down and destroying Jerusalem. Those two thick marker points are well established. But before that, yes, the timeline is changing. So, for instance, the relationship between the kings of the United Monarchy period, Saul, David, and Solomon, they've lined up now with a whole bunch of new kings that we weren't expecting before. Solomon is normally thought to be the husband of the daughter of a king called King Siamon of the 21st dynasty, a complete non-entity. You know, hardly got any monuments for the man at all. Now we've got him marrying Ramesses II's daughter. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal.
But I think the question is that the biblical chronology doesn't change.
No.
That stays the same. It's the Egyptian chronology that slides forward. That's where the Dark Age is. And I think the other part is that one of the challenges that we have is that I have in the filmmaking side of it is to say that really what we're looking for is patterns. The next question, which we haven't made a film about, is, well, why is this evidence earlier? At the very end, we just spend a little bit of time suggesting that there's an issue here. But the whole premise here is to say, look, there are patterns of evidence that match the Bible's narrative very clearly. Why is that? Then that's this next question. But I think for the most part, what I wanted to say as a filmmaker was that look and see, here's what the Bible says, here's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and that's a very legitimate way to play the game. You were very fair about everything. Just because I won the argument doesn't mean you weren't being honest, because you were.
Well, David, as a chronologist, I suggest, in the Jonah Code, it takes me 10 hours to teach people how to count to 3 days and 3 nights. But it's in less than 8 hours today, you've taught us how to count to 450. Is that not the essence of what we're dealing with here?
Absolutely. And I was absolutely terrible at maths when I was at school. And we English call it maths, by the way, not math. because it's a plural. Okay. You wouldn't say 10 police bike, would you? You'd say 10 police bikes. And you wouldn't say 5 cop, you'd say 5 cops. So it's maths, okay? Mathematics with an S on the end.
Okay.
Anyway, I was awful at maths at school. However, I seem to overcome that now with all this stuff because when it comes down to it, it's a very exciting puzzle to solve. It's one of the greatest jigsaw puzzles that man has ever invented. It's biblical history.
And so let's hit that one point, that biblical record for Solomon, and how many years after the Exodus?
Okay, this is one of the big mathematics of the Bible. We know that according to Edwin Teeler, who establishes the chronology of the divided monarchy period and the kings there, then you add on the reigns of Solomon, and you get back to, let's say, well, 925 is Rehoboam's destruction of Solomon's temple, right? So 930 is the schism, where the country is divided into 2. Add 40 years to that, you get to the beginning of Solomon's reign, we get to 970. That's the conventional date for the beginning of Solomon's reign. Then we know that he built the temple in the 4th year of his reign. So we go down to 967. Okay, so 967 is Teeler's date for the construction of the temple. And it says in the text that the Exodus took place 480 years earlier, which gets us to 1447. So roughly 1447 is when the Exodus took place, and the conquest 40 years later in 1407. Okay, then there's one more date we have in the Bible, and this is the one that's contentious, and that is the story of the 430 years of the sojourn. Now, some parts of the Bible say, especially in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and also in the Qumran fragment we have from this period, that it was 430 years from the time that Jacob entered the land in the year 2 of the famine to Moses departing with the Israelites.
Abraham. Oh,
no,
excuse me.
This is what the Masoretic text says. Okay. It says that the sojourn lasted 430 years from when the Israelites arrived in Egypt. Now, there are other texts that don't say that. For instance, the Greek LXX, or Septuagint, has a different figure. So does Josephus, the great historian of the Jews. So does Paul. Paul also describes a different length of time. And also, the one that I've missed is the Aramaic Bible also has a different time. All the others, apart from the Masoretic Hebrew and the Qumran, all have a different date, and they all agree with it, including Paul, because Paul was using the Aramaic text. So we have a different story there. What we have is, it was 430 years from Abraham's covenant with God to the time when Moses left with the Israelites. And it's divided into 2 periods of 215 years. Abraham down to Jacob, Jacob's arrival in Egypt down to Moses, 215 years each, which explains why the Bible says it was only 4 generations of the sojourn to Moses.
That's right. It would come out in the 4th generation. So Levi had a daughter, Jochebed, and she then had and married her nephew, Amram, and they had Moses, and then as Moses' offspring, the 4th generation that actually came out.
And Moses was very old at the time of Exodus 80.
That's
so
right.
You have a very different picture in those sources. How to explain it? Well, it's very simple, and you may not like this, but in the earlier text, like like the Septuagint, which is 100 years earlier than the Qumran, and also the Aramaic text, all the manuscripts are later, we know from the linguistic traits in the Aramaic text that it's actually older than the Septuagint. The text is older than the Septuagint. So we have two sources which predate the Qumran scrolls, and the Masoretic text, of course, is 500 AD. That's hundreds of years later.
Right.
And those sources all say the same thing. They say the 430 years was the time that the Israelites spent in Egypt and Canaan. And those words, and Canaan, have dropped out of the Masoretic text. They've disappeared. So it just says in Egypt in those sources, but in all the other sources, and including Paul's references, it says and Canaan. So it's the time from Abraham arriving in Canaan to the time that Moses departs out of Egypt.
And David, I think that as I have talked with Steve Law about this, we've written about this, is that I think it said 430 in the first time, and then later on it was 400.
That's correct.
And so what does that say? It was counting down. And I think that was from the time of the first promise that in 430 years your sojourn, your wandering, and then your family would go on this and they would come out. And then later on he gets the promise again, and then that time the figure was 400.
Yeah.
And so that gave me a sense that it was a countdown.
Well, it also works with 430 years from when he is told to come out, and he actually comes out of Aramea, and then 400 years from the covenant when all the land from the Euphrates to the great river in Egypt, the covenant of circumcision. So it works 400 years from then too.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't work for 430 years being in Egypt.
And the reason why that's important is that some people would like to have it 400 because that gives you a huge stretch of time in Egypt to try to find the Exodus.
Some people argue that it was 400 years of slavery. Well, obviously the Bible doesn't say that because the first so many years were when Joseph was in charge and the Israelites were prospering. The actual period of slavery is not more than 120 years.
Yeah. Can't be that. Can't be long.
And that helps you to figure out that window of how long that sequence of events in Egypt should be. So.
Okay, and we have maybe time for one more question here from our studio audience, and we thank all of you who have joined us and the questions that you sent in from Cyberspace Beyond. Now we have Joseph Smith. I'm glad the Mormon showed up from Atlanta.
Thanks. You should see my Mormon underwear. My question is there any archaeological evidence of the Hyksos during the 13th dynasty which could contribute to the influx or the increase of the Semitic people in Avaris during that time in the population of Avaris?
That's a very interesting question. They're not part of the Exodus. They come after the Exodus. If we're going to define the Hyksos as the invaders who came in from the east and took over the country and dominated the country, the Israelites have already left at that point. So they're not adding to the population. But when BTAC talks about this population of 30,000 Semites living there, that's the Israelites and the Hebrews. And remember something about those two words. The Israelites are the descendants of Jacob, the clans. The Hebrews are the mixed multitude around them. The Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites. Okay? So when the Semites go out of Egypt, and many of them are not Israelite, they're Hebrews. Okay, so there's a clear distinction. The descendants of Jacob are the Israelites. Okay, and if you read your Bible, the Israelites never refer to themselves as Hebrews. It's the opponents of the Israelites who refer to them as Hebrews, the Philistines, the Pharaoh. Because the word Habiru, Hebrew, means wanderer.
Crossover, literally.
Yeah, somebody who just wanders through the state system. And it's almost like the word gypsy is used today. They're like, it's a pejorative. You know, these people who don't belong. Okay? So Hebrews are people who are stateless people. It includes the Israelites. But the Israelites are a special group within the Hebrew group as a whole. So the Hyksos, you could say, were part of that whole element, because when they invaded, they were a horde. They came in as a horde. They were ruled by people who were of a different level, different rank, but the ordinary people that came in with them and invaded Egypt, they were also Semites.
And would you say, David, that this vacuum was created with if these events really happened and in Egypt was crushed, and they lost their army and they went through all these plagues, all this happened, a huge vacuum then was made with the Israelites leaving, and then it made it possible for another nation to come in and take over.
That's exactly what happens in history. When a civilization collapses, a new group comes in. It happened to the Roman Empire when the Visigoths came in, and the Roman Empire had weakened, the Visigoths come in and they take over. It introduces our Dark Age and the AD period, the one after the Roman Empire, which we didn't climb out of for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's the time when King Arthur was around, but we know nothing about it.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this this answer period here at the end of the showing of the movie. Again, make sure that you get the books, make sure that you get the movies, and get out there and show it in your communities. Invite your friends, your enemies over to experience this and get the word out around the world. Please join us again tomorrow. Again, we're going to circle the wagons and invite invite you to do the same in your own communities. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to be back here with Doctors Mike and Jenny Wilkins and another trail of biblical health and bringing you to your optimum in your life. We've got it's not a dead run to the end. It's not the last 100-yard sprint yet. We've got a ways to go, and we need to do it in as much health and free as much pain as possible. And so that's why we're inviting you to join us tomorrow afternoon. Again, those of you who have joined us by way of the internet, we invite you to please click on donate here and help to support what you have been enjoying all day and will continue this weekend. So from all of us here in Charlotte, North Carolina, we bid you adieu. And again, out there in your living rooms, I want you to stand up and give a standing ovation to our guests, Tim Mahoney and David Rohl, including here in the audience. Yeah.